The fluorescent lights of the ICU had a way of making everything feel eternal. No sunrise, no sunset, just that cold humming glow that told you time had stopped mattering. I had spent the last 18 months under lights exactly like those, just in a different building and a different state, pulling double shifts at a trauma center 300 miles from home. Traveling nurse contracts don't leave much room for sentimentality. You go where the hospitals need you, you work until your feet stop feeling like feet, and you send money home because that's the deal you made with yourself when you signed the first contract. I had made that deal partly for me, to pay off my student loans, to build something real, and partly for Nan. My grandmother had raised me from the time I was 9 years old, after my parents decided that their social life and their ambitions mattered more than a kid who needed stability. Nan never once made me feel like a burden. She made me feel like the whole point. So when I finally booked my flight home, unannounced, because I wanted to surprise her, because I had been picturing her face for weeks, I was not prepared for what I found. I landed on a Tuesday morning. I took a rideshare from the airport instead of calling anyone. The whole drive I was smiling, thinking about Nan's kitchen, thinking about her coffee that was always too strong, thinking about sitting at her table while she talked about her garden and pretended not to be proud of me, even though she absolutely was. The driver dropped me off at the end of her street and I walked the last block with my bag over my shoulder like I was 22 again and coming home from college. The first thing I noticed was the lawn. Nan kept her yard immaculate. She had a thing about it. Edges crisp, flower beds weeded, the small ceramic cardinal she'd had since before I was born, sitting on the front step, exactly where it always sat. But the grass was long. Not just a week's worth of long. Thick, neglected, with a thin layer of yellowed blades underneath that told me no one had touched it in at least a month. The flower beds were choked with weeds. The ceramic cardinal had been knocked over and nobody had stood it back up. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe she'd had a bad few weeks. Maybe the lawn service had flaked. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Nothing. I still had my key. I'd had it since I was 9 years old and Nan had pressed it into my hand and said, "This house is always yours." I unlocked the door and pushed it open and the smell hit me before my eyes adjusted to the dim light inside. Not a bad smell exactly, but close and stale, the way a room gets when the windows haven't been opened and someone has been very, very still inside it for a long time. "Nan?" Her voice came from the back bedroom. Thin. Reedy. Not her voice at all. I dropped my bag in the hallway and I walked fast, then faster, and when I pushed open her bedroom door I felt the floor tilt under me. She was in bed, and she was small, in a way she had never been small. Nan had always been solid. Not large, but present. The kind of person who filled a room just by being in it. The woman in the bed looked like she had been slowly erased. Her lips were cracked. The water glass on her nightstand was empty. There was a pill organizer on the dresser and half the compartments were still full, days unchecked. "Baby," she said, and she started to cry. I called 911 before I even sat down beside her. While we waited for the ambulance, I held her hand and asked her gentle questions. Clinical questions, nurse questions, even though my hands were not steady. She told me, in pieces, that she had not been feeling well for about 3 weeks. She told me the home health aide had stopped coming. She told me she had been trying to call my mother, but the calls kept going to voicemail. She told me she had run out of her blood pressure medication 4 days ago because she couldn't get to the pharmacy and no one had come to take her. 4 days without blood pressure medication. When the paramedics arrived, her BP was 192/114. I rode with her in the ambulance and I did not cry because I am a nurse and I have learned to put the crying somewhere else until later. I held her hand and I talked to her the whole way and I told her she was going to be fine and I meant it because the alternative was not something I was willing to accept. At the hospital, they admitted her immediately. The ER attending, a tired-looking man who reminded me of every attending I had ever worked with, told me she was severely dehydrated and that her blood pressure had been dangerously uncontrolled, but that we had gotten her there in time. In time. I sat with that phrase for a long moment in the waiting room after they took her back. In time. An hour later, and it might not have been. I called my mother from the waiting room. She answered on the fourth ring with the ambient noise of somewhere bright and loud in the background. Voices, music, the distinct sound of a blender running. "Hey, honey," she said, easy and warm, completely unbothered. "What's up?" "Nan is in the hospital," I said. "I'm with her now. She's stable, but it was close." A pause. Then, "Oh wow, what happened?" I told her. I kept my voice level. I am good at keeping my voice level. When I finished, my mother said, "Well, I'm glad you were there. We're actually in Scottsdale right now. Your father has a golf thing, but I'm sure she'll be fine. You're a nurse, you know what to watch for. Keep me posted, okay?" I sat very still for a moment. "Her home health aide stopped coming," I said. "She's been alone for weeks. She ran out of her medication. She was dehydrated and her blood pressure was almost 200. She was lying in bed, unable to get up, Mom." "When did you last check on her?" Another pause, longer this time. "I talked to her a few weeks ago. She seemed fine." "She wasn't fine." "Well, I didn't know that." Her voice had taken on an edge now. Defensive, the tone I had heard 10,000 times growing up. "I can't be there every minute. We have our own lives." I ended the call. I sat in the waiting room for a while after that, staring at the linoleum floor, doing the thing I had learned to do in the ICU when something terrible happened, and I still had patients to care for. I put the feeling in a box. I closed the lid, and I kept moving. There would be time to open that box later. Right now, I needed to understand exactly what had happened. The hospital social worker was a woman named Patricia who had the kind of calm that only comes from years of delivering bad news gracefully. She sat with me in a small conference room and walked me through what Nan had told her during the intake assessment. The home health aide had last come 6 weeks ago. Nan had called the agency and been told her file showed that services had been canceled, effective the previous month, per family instruction. She had called my mother. Voicemail. She had called my uncle, my mother's brother, who lived 40 minutes away. He told her he'd look into it and never called back. 6 weeks. My grandmother had been managing alone, increasingly unable to, for 6 weeks. I drove to Nan's house that evening after she was settled and stable and sleeping. I let myself in and I walked through every room slowly, the way you do when you're trying to understand a place, and I began to piece things together. The mail had piled up on the kitchen table. Bills, mostly, and a few pieces from the law office that handled Nan's estate planning. One envelope had been opened and then roughly resealed, the flap uneven and wrinkled. I opened it. It was a statement from Nan's investment account. The balance was significantly lower than it should have been. There had been 3 large withdrawals over the past 4 months, each one just under the threshold that would have triggered an automatic bank review. I sat down at Nan's kitchen table in the quiet house, and I stared at that statement for a long time. I called the investment firm the next morning from the hospital waiting room. I identified myself as Nan's medical power of attorney. She had named me 3 years ago, quietly and without telling my mother, because Nan had always been a woman who thought several moves ahead. The account representative walked me through the transaction history carefully. The withdrawals had been authorized via a signed letter of instruction. The signature on the file was Nan's, but the address the funds had been wired to was not Nan's bank account. It was my mother's. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment because I think it matters. It was not surprise exactly. It was more like the feeling of seeing a shape you already knew was there finally come into focus. The aid canceled. The medication running out. The unreturned calls. The Scottsdale golf trip. All of it assembling itself into a picture I did not want to be looking at. I called a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Margaret, and she had been recommended to me by the hospital social worker, who seemed unsurprised when I described the situation. Margaret asked me to bring everything I had. The account statements, the pill organizer, the opened mail, photos of the house when I arrived. She told me to write down everything Nan had told me while it was fresh. She told me that what I was describing had a name, financial elder abuse. She told me it was, in fact, a crime. Meanwhile, Nan improved, steadily, the way she always did things, without drama, without complaint, with a kind of quiet determination that had always made me want to be braver. On the third day, she was well enough to sit up and drink real coffee, which the nurses technically weren't supposed to let her have, but which I had smuggled in because some rules are less important than others. She held the cup with both hands and looked at me over the rim and said, "I was waiting for you." "I know," I said. "I kept thinking you'd come." "I'm here now." She nodded slowly. Then she said, with the directness that had always been one of her defining qualities, "Your mother took money from the account. I know she did. I signed something she told me was a routine form, and I think that was it." I put my hand over hers. "I know. I'm handling it. I don't want there to be a war." "There already is one," I said gently. "I'm just making sure we win it." What I found over the following days as I worked through Nan's files and spoke with Margaret and spoke with the investment firm's fraud department was worse than I had initially understood. My mother had not acted alone. My father had been involved in structuring the withdrawals, and my uncle, the one who lived 40 minutes away and had never called back, had received a portion of the transferred funds. 3 people, 3 members of Nan's family. The home health aid had been canceled not because of any care-related issue, but because my mother had decided the expense was, in her words, not necessary anymore. A phrase that appeared in a text thread I found on Nan's phone. A thread in which my mother had discussed these arrangements with my father as though they were logistics, as though Nan were a line item to be optimized. I sat with Nan's phone in my hands for a long time after reading that thread. I thought about 18 months of night shifts. I thought about the flight home I had been so happy to take. I thought about the ceramic cardinal knocked over on the front step, nobody bothering to stand it back up. I did not call my mother. I did not warn her. I had learned in the ICU that when a situation is serious, you do not telegraph your next move. You assess, you prepare, and then you act. Margaret had been busy. She had contacted the bank's Elder Financial Abuse Unit, which had a formal relationship with the district attorney's office. She had filed the paperwork to freeze the transferred accounts pending investigation. She had also discovered something that changed the picture considerably. Nan's grandfather. My great-grandfather, a man I had only known from photographs and stories, had established a family trust decades ago. Nan was the primary beneficiary during her lifetime. Upon her death, the trust passed to her descendants. But the trust document, which Nan had apparently kept in a fireproof lockbox in her closet along with a letter she had written 3 years ago and addressed to me, contained a clause that Margaret described, with understated legal satisfaction, as remarkably foresighted. The clause stated that any beneficiary who was found to have committed financial fraud against the trust's primary holder or who was found to have neglected the primary holder's care needs while holding any form of legal authority over her affairs, would be permanently excluded from inheritance consideration. Automatically. Without recourse. My great-grandfather, who had built something from nothing and who had watched enough of the world to know what people did to each other when money was involved, had written that clause in. My Nan had known it was there. She had never mentioned it. Not once, but she had given me power of attorney 3 years ago, and she had written me a letter, and she had kept that lockbox in her closet. And I understood, reading the letter she had written in her careful, slightly old-fashioned handwriting, that she had not been helpless, she had been waiting. "I hope you never have to read this," she had written. "But if you are, then something happened that I was afraid might happen, and I want you to know that I trusted you to handle it. I have always trusted you more than anyone. Don't be soft about it. Be fair, but don't be soft, that's all I ask." I was not soft about it. Margaret sent the formal legal notification on a Thursday morning. My mother, my father, and my uncle were in Scottsdale. Apparently, the golf trip had extended into a longer vacation, when they received the certified letters informing them that they were subjects of an elder financial abuse investigation, that the transferred funds had been frozen, that the trust clause had been triggered, and that their exclusion from the estate had been formally recorded. My phone started ringing at 11:37 a.m. I watched it ring. I watched it ring again. I watched the notifications stack up through the afternoon, calls, then voicemails, then texts, the tone shifting from confused to demanding to something that sounded, if I'm being precise, like fear. My mother left 6 voicemails. My father left 4. My uncle left 2, which I thought was about proportional to his level of involvement. I did not answer any of them until I was ready, which was not that day and not the next. When I did speak to my mother, finally, I kept it brief. I told her that the investigation was proceeding. I told her that the frozen funds would remain frozen pending the outcome. I told her that my focus was on Nan's recovery and on ensuring her care for however long she needed it. I told her that I was not interested in her explanation. "You can't just cut us out," she said. Her voice was tight and high. "I didn't," I said. "Great-grandfather did, years before any of this happened. He just needed the right circumstances to trigger it." A long silence. "I'm your mother." "Nan raised me," I said. "You made a choice, and it had consequences. I'm sorry it happened this way." "I'm not sorry that it did." I hung up. Nan came home from the hospital 11 days after I found her. I had taken a leave of absence from my contract, the kind of leave that good nurse managers understand when you explain the situation. And I had hired a new home health agency, vetted in person, with references I called myself. I had changed the locks, cleaned the house, restocked her medications with automatic refills, and stood the ceramic cardinal back up on the front step. She walked in slowly, leaning on my arm, and she stopped in the doorway to the kitchen and looked at the mail I had sorted neatly on the table, and the coffee already made, and the garden visible through the back window that I had spent a Saturday pulling weeds from. "You fixed my cardinal," she said. "I did." She patted my hand twice the way she always had. "Good girl." The investigation concluded 4 months later. The findings were consistent with what Margaret had outlined, and the district attorney's office filed charges against all three of them, my mother, my father, my uncle, for financial elder abuse under state statute. The civil case, running parallel, resulted in a judgment requiring full restitution of the transferred funds plus interest. I had taken a permanent position at the hospital 20 minutes from Nan's house by then. I drove her to her cardiology appointments and her garden club meetings and the Tuesday morning Bible study she had been attending for 30 years. We had coffee together every morning I wasn't on shift, her coffee always too strong, the ceramic cardinal on the front step, the garden finally looking like itself again. Some mornings, she would look at me in the middle of a conversation, nothing dramatic, just a pause, and her eyes would be very clear and steady, and she would say something like, "I knew you'd come back." And I would say, "I told you I always would," and she would nod and change the subject. There is a photograph on her refrigerator now, one I took on my phone and had printed, the two of us at her kitchen table, coffee cups in hand, light coming in through the window the way it does in October, golden and slanted. She is smiling in it. Not the careful, contained smile she used for photographs when I was growing up, but the real one, the wide one, the one I don't think many people got to see. I got to see it every day. My mother sent a letter eventually, which I read once and did not respond to. My father sent nothing. My uncle sent a card at Christmas that I imagine was his lawyer's idea. None of it changed anything. The charges were what they were. The judgment was what it was. The clause my great-grandfather had written in a trust document decades ago, for reasons he understood better than anyone living, was exactly what it was. Nan asked me once, several months after everything had resolved, whether I was angry. I thought about it honestly before I answered. "Not anymore," I said. "I was, but it's hard to stay angry when everything is okay, when you're okay." She considered that for a moment. "Your great-grandfather used to say that the best revenge is just continuing." She tilted her head slightly the way she always did when she was selecting her words carefully. "Just being here. Living well." That was his phrase. I looked out at the garden she had planted and tended for 40 years, the one I had weeded on a Saturday in September while she was still in the hospital, the one that was coming back green and full now in the spring. "I think he was right," I said. She reached over and covered my hand with hers the way she had in her hospital room, the way she had 1,000 times before. And outside the window the cardinal, the real one, a male with feathers so red they looked deliberate, landed on the feeder and sat there for a long moment in the April light, as if he had been waiting to make his entrance until the story was actually over. Maybe he had. I have thought a lot in the months since everything resolved about what actually made the difference. Not the legal clause, not the lawyer, not the frozen accounts. Those were all outcomes. What made the difference was something that happened long before any of it, in the small and unremarkable choices that accumulate into who a person actually is. Nan chose, every single day for as long as I can remember, to show up. Not dramatically, not with speeches or declarations. She just kept the coffee strong and the door unlocked, and she stood the ceramic cardinal back up every time the wind knocked it over. That was her whole philosophy as far as I could tell. You tend to the small things faithfully, and the small things hold. My mother made different choices. Not one catastrophic choice, but a long series of quiet ones. The unreturned call, the canceled aid, the form she handed Nan to sign and did not explain. Each one small enough to rationalize. Together they built something that could not be walked back. That is the thing about cause and effect that I think people misunderstand. We look for the single moment, the dramatic turning point, the villain's monologue. But consequence rarely works that way. It works the way a garden works, slowly, invisibly, until one morning you walk outside and what you planted is simply there, in full. My great-grandfather understood this. He wrote that trust clause decades before anyone needed it, not out of cynicism but out of clear-eyed knowledge about human nature. He knew that character reveals itself over time under pressure, when no one is watching. He built a structure that required nothing more than patience. The consequences would arrive on their own schedule, exactly when they were earned. What I have come to believe living through this is that integrity is not a feeling. It is not something you have in a moment of inspiration. It is a practice, like any other, and the people who have it are simply the ones who kept practicing when it was inconvenient, when no one was counting, when it would have been easy to do otherwise. Nan practiced it for 80-something years. That practice was her real estate, her real inheritance. The thing she passed to me, not in any document but in the texture of ordinary mornings. Courage is the same. I was not brave because I found documents and called a lawyer. I was able to do those things because Nan had spent years showing me what it looked like to act on what you knew was right, without drama, without hesitation, without waiting for someone to tell you it's okay. She modeled it so consistently that when the moment came, I did not have to think about it. I already knew what the next step was. If there is anything I would want someone to take from this story, it is that. The choices you make when nothing is on the line are the exact same choices you will make when everything is. There is no separate version of you that shows up in a crisis. There is only the person you have been practicing being all along. Tend the small things. Show up when it's inconvenient. Stand the cardinal back up. The rest takes care of itself.